This tutorial is covering the fourth dot point from the third subsection out of motors and generators, and it's the fourth dot point in column 3 right on the far right hand side, and this one is about pylons. Now if you don't know what pylons are, well, you're about to find out. Anyway, as you can see, there are two things you need to know about pylons. And first, it's how the transmission lines are insulated from their supporting structures, and these are the pylons. And secondly, how those pylons and hence those transmission lines that are attached to them are actually protected from lightning strikes. So let's move on and have a look at these bits of information one at a time. Transmission lines in this context is meaning the power cables that are going to be supplying bulk electricity through the power grid. And hopefully you should be already aware that these transmission lines are going to come up in a number of different variants which are based on how much voltage they're carrying. So these are the transmission lines here, okay? And sometimes you'll hear these called phase conductors as well, and hopefully you know something about three-phase electricity. So what you see here is that in these pylons, the power lines or the transmission lines come in groups of three, and that's one for each phase out of three-phase electricity. So the tall metal structures that we see here, these are the pylons, and sometimes these are called stanchions as well, but that's a fairly uncommon name for them. Anyway, the purpose of these pylons is to be holding these high voltage power lines in place, and they really do need to be tall because these power lines do need to be elevated well off the ground. And the reason for this is the electricity that's flowing along these lines here really wants to find its way down to the lowest point of electrical potential, which is almost the ground, or what we call Earth. Now, it's important here in this image that you're aware of one wire that you might not have noticed, and that's this one on the top. So that one there is not a transmission line or a phase conductor. There's going to be more on that line that runs over the top in a minute. The problem with high voltages going through transmission lines like we've got up here is that they can jump across air gaps in these huge sparks that are going to make contact with objects that are themselves in contact with the ground. So in this example here, this was coming from a newspaper in the United States, and it's a little bit difficult to see, but what you've got here is the mast of a boat that I think is being towed behind a car. And what's happened is that the mast of the boat has gotten a little bit too close to the power line, and you can see that electricity has literally jumped off the line and has hit the mast of the boat and then is traveling down to the ground that way. And the higher the voltage is that's running through the power lines, then the further that these sparks can jump. So they really need to be well out of the way and out of the reach of tall objects. Otherwise, two things are going to happen. You're going to be losing electricity from the system. Basically, as electricity is jumping off at various points along the line, and also quite obviously this is a pretty dangerous situation that you want to avoid. As you can see here, these transmission lines are also pretty thick as well. And they're certainly much thicker than they look, especially if you're a long way down on the ground looking up at them. And being thick, that also makes them pretty heavy as well. So why are they so thick? Well, there's a number of different reasons for this, and mainly because the bigger the cross-sectional area that these cables are going to have, this means that it's going to lower the resistance that's in the cables, and that's important for preventing power loss in the system. And the relationship between cross-sectional area of a conductor and resistance, you should remember from the Year 11 course. The other reason why these cables do need to be thick is because that they really do need to be quite structurally strong enough to support their own weight as they're strung between pylons. Being metal and being quite thick and long, they do get very heavy. So what you do notice here is that the power lines, they do sag under their own weight. And you can use your imagination here, but there's going to be quite a fair bit of of stress on the pylons at these points here, like I'm circling, as you can see, that's going to be pulling on the pylons. Now, the main problem as well, apart from the weight, is wind. And as the wind blows through these power lines, they tend to make them sway and carry on a bit. And this means that when the wind is pulling against them, that is causing additional mechanical stress and strain that's on the pylon. So it's for this reason that these pylons here are going to be, well, they do need to have to be made out of steel, because really it's the only material that's structurally up to the job, and especially for these pylons that are carrying very, very high voltages. So the obvious problem here with steel pylons is that, well, steel's obviously a metal, and obviously all metals conduct electricity. So this means that the transmission lines, they can't actually be touching the bare metal of the pylon. Otherwise, the power is simply going to, travel down the pylon and go to the ground instead of along the line. So if we have a look at this image here, what's happening is that it's slightly off the picture, but electricity is traveling this way, but I can't have this in contact with the pylon. So what happens here is the electricity actually goes through these little curved bits and is going to be connecting up to the power line on the other side here, and it's bypassing the pylon altogether. So here what you've got is these series of, usually they're a ceramic like porcelain or glass insulators, and they resemble discs which are simply stacked together in a chain. The other reason why you need to have these insulators here is if you were to touch the pylon at any point, especially down at the ground, then you're going to get electrocuted if this transmission line is in direct electrical contact with the pylon itself here. So what you should be aware of with these types of insulators is that they're obviously stacked together in a big line, and the more that you've got together in the stack, then the more insulation that this is going to provide. So the higher the voltage that's being carried through the lines, the more insulators you need to have in this chain. If it was a little bit shorter, all that would happen is that the electricity would simply arc across to the pylon and connect it that way. All right. I don't know if you've ever looked at these too closely, but these insulators are slightly dome-shaped. They're not flat, and there's a good reason for this. And this is quite simply so that especially in cities, you get pollution and dirt and other crap is building up on top of the insulators. And if you get this layer on top, what can happen is that it can actually itself become electrically conductive, and especially when it's wet. So this dome shape is to discourage pollution and stuff from sitting on top, and especially when it's wet, then the domes get a nice little wash as the rain sheets over the top of them. So the dome shape here is keeping these insulators clean and reasonably dry. And the other thing here is that the dome is, the disc shape in particular is giving the insulator a bigger surface area. And therefore this longer surface area is providing then a longer pathway that power would have to travel from the line onto the pylon, and therefore it's also increasing the amount of resistance in the insulator, because this resistance is going to increase with the amount of distance that the electricity can have has got to travel. So if we have a look at these in a little bit of detail here, so here you can clearly see these are a porcelain one. They're a glazed porcelain to protect them from the weather. So the dome shape is to keep the stuff from accumulating on the top and being conductive, and underneath you'll see it's also got these little ripples, and again that's to increase the distance that electricity would have to travel if it was to try and move its way through the insulator. So they do provide very, very high levels of insulation. So these stacks here of the insulators, often they're referred to as strain insulators because the power lines are directly attached to them, and therefore they need to be able to withstand this sort of pull of the strain or the weight, and also the tension in the cable. And you can generally estimate how many volts are in a power line by counting the number of discs that you've got in the stack. So obviously, like I said before, the bigger the voltage, the more insulation you need, and hence the more discs that you're going to find in the stack. Now, an old rule of thumb used to be that each disc typically is going to insulate around about 11 kilovolts, which is 11,000 volts. So if you were to see an insulator with 3 discs, then you would obviously then be insulating against a 33 kilovolt voltage that's flowing through the line. If you're looking at power lines that have recently been installed or upgraded, they might not be following this old pattern because the new insulator designs have come along and they've changed over time. So some insulators you might see are still the old glass or ceramic types, but there's new polymer ones which have got sort of different properties. But one thing that you can almost guarantee is that for any voltage through these lines here that is above the 33 kilovolt mark, the power lines are actually suspended underneath the strain insulator here. So and this is what's called a suspension insulator, because the insulator is here dangling downwards and the power cable is attached to it at the bottom. And these are the ones that you're always going to see on the metal pylons. They're always going to be of the suspension design. So what about for voltages that are 33 kilovolts and below? Well, these are the ones you're going to be familiar with the power lines that are probably running alongside your street. And in this case, the power lines, they don't have to be the suspension type. The power lines are simply resting on top of the insulator that's separating it from the structure. And sometimes you might see these going sideways too. Here's one that's going sideways. That one there is actually a strain insulator. This one here that I'm pointing to isn't. It's a slightly different design. So this is what you typically see on the lower voltage parts of the power distribution network. Like I said, you're going to find them on the wooden telegraph poles, or sometimes those poles are made out of concrete as well. So these insulators, they can be similar to the strain or suspension insulators that you see on pylons, and quite often they do follow that 11 kilovolt per disc rule. So this one here, I could estimate that that is a 33 kilovolt line, because as you can see, I've got 1, 2, 3 discs in the stack. But what's different about these ones is that they don't need to be taking the huge mechanical strains like a pylon does, because these lower voltage lines are much thinner. The distance between the poles tends to be much shorter, and so this means that the lines are under less mechanical tension. So these designs on top, quite often these are referred to as beehive insulators because they sort of look like old beehives. And believe it or not, people actually collect old insulators, and especially of these beehive types. For some reason, I have no idea, but that's what they are into. And some of these designs and from different manufacturers over time, they do get very rare and quite collectible, and they do attract some prices that are pretty high considering what they are. So this next little bit is about how the pylons themselves are protected from lightning strikes. Now, lightning has got a desperate urge to make its way to the ground because that's where the lowest point of electrical potential is. And as you should know already, lightning is really attracted to things that are tall, to things that are pointy, and to metal. So unfortunately, this means that pylons fall into all these categories. They're both tall, they're pointy, and they're metal. So they're going to be struck by lightning quite regularly. Now, have a look here. This here, as you can see in the image, is obviously a bad situation for a number of reasons. It's going to be causing dangerous power surges in the lines. It's not a great image here, but down the lines here, you're going to get huge surges that are going to be potentially damaging other parts of the network, and in particular, the transformers at substations, which at some point at the end of the line, you're going to run into a transformer. So when lightning strikes, there are a few different scenarios. What you can have is that the lightning can strike the pylon directly, and then if it does, it just travels straight to ground from there. And that's probably the best case scenario, but unfortunately what happens is that even though the lightning will go through the pylon, partially it's going to be moving along through the transmission lines as well, and that's a bad situation. The other thing is that if the lightning hits the pylon, it's pretty much going to be ignoring those suspension insulators that are separating the transmission lines from the pylons. Now, these insulators, they might be all right at insulating 500 kilovolts that are going through the lines here at a really low current. But unfortunately, lightning is carrying many hundreds of kilovolts, and you're looking at thousands of amps of current as well. So the lightning can very easily travel from the pylon here then straight onto the transmission lines. Now, a slightly less common scenario here is where the lightning will simply come down and make a direct hit onto the transmission line itself, but this really is the worst case scenario, because once it hits the line, then the lightning is going to be traveling straight down the line and is going to avoid pylons. So essentially you've got the whole lightning bolt heading towards a transformer somewhere further along in the electricity distribution network. Now, at these substations, to protect the transformers, there are certain safety cutout devices there, but they really don't provide a 100% guaranteed protection against lightning damage. And every year there are heaps and heaps of transformers that are permanently knocked out by lightning. So what's actually protecting the pylon is this single thinner wire, and if you notice, that's that one up there, that's running along the very top of the pylons. And in some cases, depending on the design of the pylon itself, you might have more than one of these. And this wire goes by many different names. Sometimes you'll hear it called the ground wire or the ground line, static wire, static line, shield wire, shield line, and so on. So I'm just going to call it the static line from now on. And if you write that in your exam, your markers will know what you mean. So normally no electricity is flowing in this line whatsoever. And really all it is, it's kind of just like a long horizontal lightning rod. Now, since it's at the very top of the pylon here, this means that almost always when lightning strikes, that it's actually going to hit the static line instead, and it's going to avoid the rest of the pylon and also the transmission lines attached to it altogether. And once this lightning is in the static line, well, it still is going to want to make its way to the ground, but since it's sort of been trapped in this metal wire, the lightning is going to prefer to stay in it, and because, well, that's the pathway that's got the lowest amount of electrical resistance. So now that it's inside the wire, we can direct it to where we want to go, and this means that we can safely avoid damaging anything expensive and important that's along the way. So if we do get a lightning strike to the static line, so sometimes you hit the line, sometimes you hit the pylon at the top where the line joins it, but you've got one of two things that can happen. So the first thing to notice here is that the static line is not insulated from the pylon. Okay, it's not insulated from the pylon, and that's what's making it different from the transmission lines here, which are heavily insulated from the pylon. So Because it's not insulated, the lightning is just simply going to travel to the ground using the shortest route, which is usually directly through the pylon itself, and this is usually straight through the the center of the pylon, through the metal of the structure. And in doing this, it avoids these, it's hard to see in this image, that the horizontal sections of the tower here where the lines are typically connected to. So you're going to be traveling through like so, straight to the ground. And these pylons are very, very well grounded. And in some circumstances, what you might have is another cable that's similar to the one running along the top here. You've got a similar cable that also runs straight through the pylon itself, and that's directing the lightning directly into the ground at the base of the pylon. And in doing so, this lightning is going to be avoiding the rest of the structure, and that's pretty much how just a regular old lightning rod works. But in some situations, what happens is that when the lightning has hit the top of the pylon, it finds that, well, going straight down here may not always be actually the path of least resistance. So the second option here is when you've got the lightning hitting the static line. Okay, so let's say I hit the static line there. And then what it's going to do is it's going to, instead of traveling through the pylon, travel horizontally along that static line, and it's going to eventually reach a point where it is sufficiently grounded. So let's say that the next pylon along, or it could be any other pylon nearby, that is grounded in such a way that the lightning will then take a path to ground that way. Now, if the static line doesn't reach the next pylon, at least as the last method of protection is that it will be grounded at the substation where the static line eventually ends up. So here's the important thing to remember: the two key differences here, between the static lines and the transmission lines. So firstly, the static line is connected to the pylon, and the transmission lines are well insulated, so no electricity can flow between the transmission line and the pylon. And the second is that typically the transmission lines, well, they should be always carrying electricity, and the static line, if you look very carefully, there it is, the static line normally carries no electricity whatsoever unless it's been struck by lightning. Time now for a couple of sample answers, depending on which angle the question is taking regarding transmission lines. So the first one, explain how transmission lines are insulated from supporting structures. Obviously, everything I've told you here doesn't necessarily need to be included into an answer that you give, but this is to give you some background information so you understand the concepts. So transmission lines are insulated from supporting structures such as metal pylons and wooden poles by means of disc-shaped insulators made out of a non-conductive material such as glass or porcelain that separates the transmission line from the pylon or pole. Higher transmission voltages require longer insulators because high voltages can spark across larger distances and reach the pylon or pole. The insulators are specially shaped to provide a longer resistance pathway and to stay clean. Without insulation, the pylon or pole will become electrified, and touching it would likely result in fatal electric shock. That's really all that you need to be taking away from this one. What about if we are taking the lightning angle? In this sample answer, we're going to explain how we protect against lightning strikes, and we're going to go like this. Metal pylons that support transmission lines are at risk of lightning strikes. Strikes to line themselves can disrupt and damage the electricity distribution network. They are protected from lightning strikes by means of a separate cable called the static line that runs across the tops of the pylons and is electrically connected to the pylons themselves. It normally carries no current. Since lightning is more likely to hit the highest point, it will hit the static line when it hits a pylon. it can then be safely directed to the ground via the pylon itself, or can travel along the static line to another suitable location where it can be grounded. And one last bonus fact, I suppose you could call it. If you are so inclined, head over to this website here, which is www.pylonofthemonth.org. And this is a site for those pylon fanciers amongst you who just, for some reason or other, can't get enough of pylons. I'm not making this stuff up either. There are people that are into pylon spotting. And to be honest, I laughed at this when I first saw it. And then if you have a look on the website, it actually does get pretty interesting when you realize just how many different designs there are out there across the world, and there are literally thousands, and the various purposes for why they're used. And you can see people who go along, they take these nice glamour shots of pylons in particularly picturesque locations, or unusual pylons that you don't see every day. And well, look, I'm not going to spoil it for you anymore. Why don't you head over to the website yourself and go and have a look. And for this one, that's about it. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.